series, 75 lecture series. As you know, it's being organized for a very important cause and very relevant cause, because we are all going to celebrate the 75 glorious years of India's independence. Friends, ICAR has taken many activities to celebrate the 75 years of independence. And one of the activity which is very popular now is the 75 lecture series up to 15th August 2022. And I'm happy to inform all of you that we have already completed 50 lectures. And today is the 51st lecture. And these lectures are so popular now that wherever we go and wherever there is a meeting, even in the governing body meeting, one vice chancellor was saying it's a very useful lecture series for the students and for the faculty. So keeping in view the past importance of these lectures and other things, in the same series, we have a very important lecture today also. And the topic is the quest for a zero hunger, India lessons from the Green Revolution. And that is by a very prominent speaker, a very prominent researcher, Professor Prabhu Pingali. I will just briefly introduce about the speaker. Professor Prabhu Pingali is the founding director of TCI, and presently he is the chair of the ICAR governing board and a professor in the Charles Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management, with joint appointments in the Division of Nutritional Sciences and the Department of Global Development in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University. Prior to moving to Ithaca in June 2013, Professor Pingali was the Deputy Director of the Agriculture Development Division of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from 2008 to May 2013. Professor Pingali was elected to the US National Academy of Science as a foreign fellow in May 2007. He was the president of the International Association of Agriculture Economists from 2003 to 2006. He was also elected fellow of the American Agricultural Economics Association in 2006 and of the International Association of Agricultural Economists in 2009. We are all eagerly waiting for the lecture of Professor Pingali, and I'll not extend much, but I'll just also thank Professor Mahapatra, Secretary DARE and DG ICAR. He is chairing, and this is the first meeting today, I can just tell you, in the hybrid mode. The Deputy Director Generals, the directors of the institutes, deliberate institutes, they are physically present in this CAP 2, Krishi Anusandhan Bhavan, Building 2. And we are just trying that, let us see how best we can conduct this in the hybrid mode. And maybe subsequently we can shift from the hybrid mode to the totally physical mode. So let us just see how we proceed. And again, I want to thank all the participants, especially Deputy Director Generals, the representatives from the ICRISET, Dr. Padi is here, and other colleagues are here. And our colleagues, senior colleagues from the headquarters, they are all present here. So I hand over the proceedings to Professor Pingali to further take it. Thank you, sir. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for coming all the way from US to deliver this lecture. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Mahapatra. Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a great pleasure for me to be here in Delhi today in ICAR and to participate in the 75th anniversary lecture series, the 75th anniversary of India's independence. It's a great honor to actually be the first to do this in a hybrid mode. Initially, I was going to do this on Zoom, but since I was planning to be in India, I thought it would be good to do it in person. Imagine we're celebrating 75 years of Indian independence. Oops. Looks like. Okay, that's taken care of. We're celebrating 75 years of India's independence, and we've seen enormous progress. When India became independent, India was a very poor country with very high levels of food insecurity, high levels of famine. Hunger was prevalent. And today, we are talking about India being an emerging economy, becoming a major global power, a country that's moving rapidly into middle income status, a country with rapid urbanization, rapid growth in incomes. So we have a lot to celebrate. But even as we go through that process, and even as we recognize the major achievements, we should recognize that we're also a country with the largest number of hungry people. We're also the country with the largest number of malnourished children and underweight women. And we, as a country, we've been recognizing this problem. As a country, we've been recognizing this dichotomy between growth that's happening and the rise in middle class incomes, but at the same time seeing this problem of chronic malnutrition, chronic hunger, and chronic rural poverty. And that's being recognized, and it's recognized through government policy. And one of the ways that that recognition has come is through investments in agriculture and asking for doubling agriculture productivity. And thinking about using agriculture as an engine of growth as it was done in the past. So that's an important policy imperative that the government is pursuing. So as we look at agriculture, revitalizing the role of agriculture as an engine of growth, we need to then ask the question, what are some of the lessons we've learned from the past? What are the lessons that we've learned from the Green Revolution? The lessons which were positive and the lessons which were not so positive. And how do we use these lessons as we continue to promote agriculture as an engine of growth and as a way of enhancing food security? So that's what I'd like to talk about today. And so let me start with one slide that I think summarizes the best for all of us on what we have achieved in terms of agriculture in this country. This slide shows you what's happening to rice imports and exports since 1961. Look, can you imagine? Just little over 60 years ago, you had a country that was importing massive amounts of food, massive amounts of food grain, rice, wheat, etc. And our dependence on food imports was tremendous. But look what happened. Since about 1990, India has become a major food exporter. India has become a major rice exporting country. We haven't been importing rice since about 1990. We still have some wheat imports, but it's at the margin. So if I can think about one way to summarize the impact of our investments in agriculture, it's to look at the way in which we've transformed ourselves from being food deficit to becoming a food exporting country. I think what agricultural development has done is that it has made famine history. We no longer think about India as being at a risk of famines. Yes, we have hunger, but the idea of widespread deficiency in food availability is no longer something that we would worry about. Another slide that tells you how far we've come is to look at what's per capita availability of staple grains. And if you look at per capita availability of staple grains, even as populations have been rising, even as overall growth rate in population continues to be high, we find that the rate of growth in food supplies has surpassed population growth and the increased demand through rising income. So on a per capita basis, we've seen that overall grain availability has continued to be high and continued to rise. And that's especially true when you think about wheat and how wheat production has risen over the years and primarily through the Green Revolution. The other aspect of agriculture development that is not generally discussed is that agriculture has been an engine of growth. Economists will tell you that. Economists will tell you that India started as a predominantly rural economy with the vast majority depending on agriculture, on small farm agriculture. And because of agriculture productivity growth, what we've seen is rise in small farm incomes. And with the rise in small farm incomes, small farmers starting to purchase goods and services outside agriculture. And that then kickstarted the growth in the overall economy. And so today, as the overall GDP rises, the share of agriculture falls. And that doesn't mean agriculture is not important. Agriculture continues to be a very important part of the economy, but the overall size of the economy keeps rising because of the growth in the non-agricultural sectors. And that structural transformation happened because of the primary investments that were made in agriculture in the 60s and beyond that, and with the kickstarting of the Green Revolution. So let's ask ourselves, what has worked? What made the Green Revolution a success? So if you think about that, I think one of the big issues, criteria for the success has been long-term sustained investments in agriculture research and development. I think without that sustained investments in research and development in agriculture, we would not have seen the success that we have. I'm sitting here in ICAR and in the Indian Agriculture Research Institute. I mean, this is where it happened. These were the pioneers in investments in agriculture research. Professor Swaminathan, Dr. Paroda, etc., luminaries who made this happen right here on this campus. And I think that's something we have to be really proud of, the investments that took place. But what's important is that we see continued high levels of investments in agriculture research and development. Because the work is not done, there's still a long way to go, and I'll be talking about that. The second, the technology itself would not have worked if you did not have investments in irrigation infrastructure. And of course, roads, transport, and other infrastructure. So it's not accidental that the big changes in productivity that happened were in areas where early investments in irrigation infrastructure took place. Areas such as Punjab, Haryana, some of the Delta regions in the southern states like Andhra, Tamil Nadu, etc. These were the areas where the investments, early gains in the Green Revolution happened. And then subsequently, groundwater irrigation using pumps, etc., created further opportunities for expanding in terms of areas adopted through the Green Revolution. But the third aspect of this is, as we think about the Green Revolution, we have to also recognize that the total area under cultivation, the net cultivated area, has remained relatively stable over the past 5 decades, even as overall productivity and crop outputs have increased. And that's been because of intensification of cropping. So you're going from single crop to double, sometimes triple crops. And that intensification of cropping has been one major gain that we've seen through the Green Revolution. And that allowed us to continue to be productive, continue to feed the growing population without expanding the land area. Imagine what it would have been like if we had low productive 1 ton, 1.5 ton food crop systems. Imagine how much land we would have needed if we had to feed our population with that low productive levels. But because of higher yields, because of higher intensification, we were able to expand output without increasing land area. And that allowed us to release some lands into forest, into wildlife preserves, etc., which would not have happened without the technology change. So when I think about the big lessons from the Green Revolution, the positive, I think about it in terms of the 4 I's. The 4 I's are innovations in agriculture technology, infrastructure investments, irrigation, power, roads, etc. Institutional reforms, especially in land rights, access to credit, access to services, etc. And finally, incentives for enhancing productivity, price policy, price incentives, input subsidies, procurement policies for food grain procurement, for the food security stocks, the PDS, etc. So all of these come together. These 4 I's have come together to create the success that we've seen in the Green Revolution. But there've also been issues that haven't worked as well. The Green Revolution also had consequences that we could have been better at managing. I think one of the consequences is that we've seen regional differences in productivity gains. We all know the story. And that's primarily because of a lack of investments in irrigation and other infrastructure. You've seen eastern part of India, central parts of India that have lagged behind. But I also think it's because of this focus that we've had on just the top 3 staples, rice, wheat, and maize. So there are parts of India where it makes sense to increase productivity of rice and wheat. The agroecologies work. But there are other areas where the agroecologies are not so suitable for intensification of rice and wheat. But if you focus on only rice and wheat, then you create these regional differences. But today we know that certain parts of the country, millets or pulses or oil seeds are much more suited to that particular agroecologies. And so it's not surprising that the central part of India has now become the oil seed belt of India, growing soybeans, cotton, etc. And if we had initially thought through those, we may not have seen as much of interregional differences as we do today. And because of that focus that we've had on the primary staples, we've seen over time some of the crowding out that's taken place. Pulses, which were very predominant in the northern parts of India, in the Indo-Gangetic plain, actually disappeared entirely from that area. Coarse cereals, millet, sorghum, etc., they completely disappeared from major parts of the crop producing areas within India. as they were replaced by rice and wheat. And these are the crops that are important from a nutrition point of view. They have high micronutrient content, pulses have high protein content, etc. And so today we are talking about how do we rejuvenate these crops. But that change happened because of that initial focus that took place. So hunger continues to be a challenge, even as we've made enormous progress. Today, we are looking at around 15% of population not having adequate amount of calories on a daily basis. And that's calculated through the FAO's undernourishment numbers. But imagine it would have been closer to 45 to 50% in the 1960s. So we've made big progress, but we still have a long way to go. But the good news is that if you think in terms of the depth of hunger, the difference between the current, what calorie consumption is today relative to the minimum required for people who don't have the minimum, then that depth is actually coming down. So in the 1990s, that the difference was around 200 calories, and today it's coming closer to 100 calories. So we're making progress. We're making progress in reducing that gap between the calorie consumption of the undernourished populations and the minimum needed for survival. So that's good news in terms of progress. But even as we address the problem of hunger, calorie hunger, we're still facing the triple burden. So the hunger problem, the hidden hunger problem of deficiency of micronutrients, and then the emerging problems of obesity. And that's something we need to be concerned about. And we have to think about these problems affecting women and children at a much greater level than they affect men. And so the gender difference, the age difference in the risk of malnutrition is much higher. And that's an issue we'd have to address rather than think about everybody being equal. And as I said, even as we address the chronic problems of malnutrition, this rising incidence of obesity rates is something that we need to take very, very seriously as we look ahead. So here's some data on child malnutrition. The latest NFHS data gives us an opportunity to see what's been happening over time since the early 1990s to 2021. And we see that there's progress. There's progress on reducing child stunting, underweight, and wasting. But we could do a lot better. Today, we're still looking at a third of the children being stunted and almost a third being underweight. So that's still a huge population that continues to be malnourished, and one can do better. But the way one would think about it is to look at this not just at the national level, but to look at it at a more disaggregated level, to look at it at a regional level and even at a district level. And you find that there are certain parts of the country, especially in the eastern and central parts of India, where the child malnutrition problems are much more severe. And identifying these areas and identifying discrete interventions for those areas is really important. And certainly the work that's being done by ICAR and by Niti Aayog and the ministries of women and child development, etc., are identifying these opportunities. And I think that's something we need to keep working on. It's also important to know that the poverty issues are very closely linked to productivity and to improved nutrition. You find areas which have seen very high productivity levels have seen significant drops in rural poverty. And so today, rural poverty is really concentrated in certain geographies of the country. And addressing rural poverty in those areas can make a big difference as we make this transition towards middle income status. And the unintended environmental consequences is a story that's well known. We all talk about it. We talk about the effects of soil degradation because of intensive cropping, intensive water use, etc. We talk about the depletion of groundwater systems, especially in areas like Punjab, Haryana, etc., where the groundwater table is falling very, very rapidly because of intensive use of water for rice and wheat production systems. And about the use of chemical inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, and the way in which they've risen. So in all these cases, it's the inefficiency in the use of the inputs that's the issue, not the inputs per se. It's the inappropriate ways in which a technology is used is the big issue, not the technology per se. And that's related to the incentives farmers have to be better in how they produce their crops, to be smarter in the way they use inputs. And that the incentives are affected by cheap access to inputs and very subsidized pricing. So it's not surprising that if you provide electricity almost for free, then farmers will pump as much water as they want. And they would not worry about being more efficient. It's only when the incentives are right that you'll see the transition to a more efficient and a smarter production system. So those are some of the big concerns, some of the big lessons that we've learned from the Green Revolution. And as we look ahead, we need to say, how do we get better in reducing some of the negative consequences? What should we do from a technology point of view, a policy point of view, an institutional point of view in order to be better while still enhancing productivity? And history is so important in allowing us to think through these issues. Otherwise, we'll be repeating the same issues that we've dealt with in the past. So even as we try to look at that and to look at increasing productivity, we should look at some of the new and emerging concerns that are coming up. I think one of the big issues today as we look at agriculture and food systems is that we are no longer looking at a predominantly poor country. You're looking at a country that's become much richer with a large share of middle-class population and rising middle-class populations with rising incomes. And as that happens, the demand for food also rises. And overall demand for the quantity of food rises, but also the quality and diversity of food rises. So you'll see an increase in demand for non-starchy foods, fruits, vegetables, etc. And the demand for staple grains leveling off and declining over time. And the data on this is very clear. So over time, when you look from the 1970s to today, you'll see that the share of cereals in total consumption beginning to drop relative to the share of other food groups, vegetables, fruit, livestock products, etc. The challenge for us is how do we enhance the productivity of all these other food groups? How do we enhance investments in fruits, vegetables, livestock products, etc., so that we can repeat that same productivity trends that we've seen for the basic staples? And that's going to be a big issue. It's a big issue because even as people are making the transition, the, the price of non-staples is high relative to staples. So recently, the Lancet journal put together a commission to look at what a balanced diet would look like in different countries. And they will put out a report on what the Eat Lancet minimum standards would be like for a balanced diet. So I took this information and we published a paper on that, the references down there, where we said, if you took those recommendations for the balanced diet and tried to apply it to rural India, what would that look like? So on the left-hand side, you'll see in rural India, and here we had primary data from UP, Bihar, Orissa, and Maharashtra. You'll see the actual cost. If you take all of the food groups and take the minimum price in each of those food groups, the actual cost that for the diet that's consumed today is close to around 50 cents per person per day. In US dollars, we calculated that, but we can do that in rupees. And if you think about the Eat Lancet recommendation, again, looking at the minimum cost per food group, the Eat Lancet recommendation works out to be around $3.50 per person per day. Now, there's no way that you'll be able to go from 50 cents a day to $3.50 per day. So there's no point really of us saying, here's a balanced diet that you should eat, when we don't have a mechanism to provide a supply of those food groups at a price that's affordable to rural populations, especially the rural poor. And this price data makes it very clear. This price data shows that over time, your staple grain prices, I don't know if you can see those, if the staple grains would be in the blue cereals, that the staple grain prices have been become relatively stable. Over time, there's been up and down, but relatively stable. But the big price differences, the big price rise has been in vegetables, fruit, pulses, etc. And when we think about a balanced diet, that's where we should be. So what we need in terms of investments is to get to a way in which overall supply enhancement, overall investments in value chains, etc., and rural markets and infrastructure, in order to bring down the relative price difference between fruits, vegetables, pulses, relative to staple cereals. And that's a major challenge, I think. And that's one that needs a lot of focus. So that's one side of the story. But one of the consequences of having this big price difference between the more nutritious food and the staples is that you begin to see this movement more and more into processed foods, more and more into fatty food, high sugar food, high energy diets, etc., rather than a balanced diet. And that then brings in much of the obesity problems that we are seeing today. And unless you can correct that food system to be more balanced and more nutritious, we won't be able to arrest the obesity issues today. But what's interesting about the obesity incidences are pretty much in the areas where productivity growth has been high, where incomes have been rising, where urbanization has been high. So this map on obesity is the flip side of the map on undernourishment and micronutrient malnourishment. And so these more progressive states are the ones where the obesity issues are emerging much more greatly. And that's something I think we need to be looking at. How do we address that? How do we create better food systems for these areas? And just to add to that point, as incomes are rising, as urbanization is happening, the obesity trends will continue to be important, and it's something that, as a government policy, we need to take as seriously as we take the undernutrition and the food security issues. Then, of course, as an emerging concern, the concerns around climate change. Climate change issues are a big concern. Climate change impacts on agriculture, but also agriculture's contribution to climate change. The issue of agriculture's contributions to greenhouse gas emissions is really important. The contributions to greenhouse methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, etc., that come from intensive rice production systems, intensive livestock production systems. And how do we double productivity while minimizing the emissions or minimizing the net increase in emissions is something that's a challenge. And related to that is the energy use in agriculture as that's rising. And how do we get more efficient in energy use? How do we get more efficient in terms of renewable energy use, solar power in particular, as a mechanism to manage this trade-off between productivity and climate change? So one of the things my group at Cornell does is, as we think about nutrition, as we think about food security, we think about it in a multidimensional, multisectoral sense. And so in terms of India, as we look ahead, much of the food security issues, the malnutrition issues, require that multisectoral approach. They require investments in agriculture and agriculture development, which is important, but it also requires looking at access to diversity of food groups, affordability of the diversity of food groups, access to food for the poor through safety net programs, and that food being nutritionally richer than just providing staples. Looking at intra-household differences, so equity in food access for women and children relative to men, equity not just in quantity, but also in quality. And then investments in water, sanitation, toilets, etc., because the sanitation interface with health and nutrition is really important. So taking that multisectoral convergence is, I think, a really important way in which we think as we move forward in addressing the food security issues. So let me sum up with some of the policy lessons for enhancing food and nutrition security. So as we look ahead and as we've learned from the Green Revolution experience, and we've made big progress on addressing calorie hunger, but now I think our shift should be to looking at micronutrient malnutrition and to look at the emerging problem of overnutrition. And it's really crucial that food and agriculture policy should look beyond staple grains and to focus on enhancing the availability and affordability of diverse nutrient-rich foods. One of the ways in which one would do that is to promote smallholder supply of this diversity. And that happens through investments in rural markets, investments in value chains that bring in smallholders and make it create opportunities for smallholders to participate in this growth process, in this growth in demand for diverse foods. And to promote incentives for being smarter and more efficient in farming and more efficient in input use. Price policies, input price policies, input subsidies, etc., are important areas that one needs to look at if we want to be more smarter and more efficient in the way we farm. Then India has one of the largest food-based safety net programs, the PDS program, the midday meal program, the ICDS programs, etc. And these programs provide staple grains, but the opportunity for providing a more diverse food basket into these safety net programs, especially bringing in pulses, bringing in micronutrient-rich foods, millets, etc., into the safety net programs, into the PDS programs, is an important opportunity, and that can then trigger growth of smallholders in the more marginal production environments. Convergence across ministries, across sectors in addressing hunger and nutrition goals is an important area, as I've mentioned earlier. And so is our policies that explicitly promote rural women's empowerment. Because as women become more empowered, they become leaders in changing nutrition outcomes within the households, particularly for children. Infrastructure investments in water systems, sanitation, hygiene, for improved health and nutrition outcomes, and that interface between drinking water, sanitation, and food systems is a really important interface that we should be looking at. And finally, as we look ahead, consumer behavior is also important. Consumer behavior change as consumers become more knowledgeable about what's better food, what's better diets, and consumer demand for better diets, then also triggers a supply response. So consumer behavior change is an important part of the policy interventions that need to happen. So with that, let me stop here, and I'd be happy to take any questions from the room or outside on Zoom. But if you want to find out more about our program at Cornell, please look at our website, tci.cornell.edu, or you can follow us on various social media. Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Pingali. Friends, if you have any query or questions or clarification, you can please put it in the chat box, or if there is a request, we can also allow you to speak. From this house also, I request maybe the economist, our Dr. He has taken over as the director of NIF. I think this is your first day today? Third day, okay. First, yeah. Put on.
As usual, it is very always pleasant to listen to you, particularly on the issues related to nutrition, food security. But one thing that, of course, it bothers us in India, despite despite a significant progress in agricultural production, be it the cereals or the horticulture products or the livestock products, but still this problem of undernutrition or malnutrition, it remains. So I don't know whether it is the problem of the supply side, or it is the affordability, or it is the distribution. Because on distribution front also, we have huge surpluses, now. Day before yesterday, I was reading the newspaper that this year we exported 21 million tons of rice and 7 million tons of wheat. That's a very big achievement. So this casts some kind of doubts, particularly on the norms, for the nutritional norms, calorie norms. We are depending more on the FAO norms or the global norms. So we don't have our own norms. Today there was a news item from the NIN that we are revising the norms based on our own standards. So maybe that is some kind of another issue, of course, that is maybe there are some extraneous factors. Particularly as you have in the end, you have highlighted the role of sanitation, hygiene, drinking water, and all those good, because they also govern the nutritional outcomes of the people. Now, another point, of course, that where we have faltered, particularly on the agricultural growth point of view, there is no denying that fact that economic growth is mirrored in the agricultural growth. Whether it's in India or any state of India, whatsoever we talk about, if we neglect agriculture, so that then definitely there is going to be a problem. But over the period, what has happened is we didn't align our policies to the changing production environments, be it the subsidies or be it the minimum export prices. And these have resulted, as you highlighted, the several hidden costs to the environment, to groundwater or soil degradation and all those kind of things. Now, finally, of course, that again, that obesity and malnutrition, they keep on continuing. And you have very rightly pointed out, it is more in the high agriculture or high producing this one states. So what could be the possible reasons? So to me, it seems that it is the heavily mechanized agricultural operation there. So they have displaced the manual labor. People, you go to Rajasthan, you will find people very sturdy and healthy. You go to Himachal Pradesh, Jammu and Kashmir, but not in Punjab or in the East Godavari, where this kind of problems are there. Finally, I have one comment, because the future of our agriculture or the nutrition or food security, it will depend on basically three factors. One is the farm size, how we organize the farmers, because our land holding size, it is just above 1 hectare. So how we organize that to improve efficiency and sustainability of the system. Another is, of course, that how we manage the groundwater, because again, the policies have damaged the groundwater. And as Professor S.S. John, he said that Punjab will be a desert in another 10, 15 years. Then, of course, the climate change. It's becoming a big, issue, given this recent IPCC reports. So temperature, and we are seeing it here in March. In February, it was very cold. In March, it is becoming very hot. So these are some of my concerns. So if you can highlight some of these issues. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Dr. Berthal. These are really important points, and you've covered many of the issues that that I've been trying to raise. Let me pick a few things. I think the priority now is to see how do we get to more diversity in the food system. And as we think about getting to more diversity on the food system, we need smallholder farmers to be part of that, because the supply has to come from smallholder agriculture. That's the agriculture we have. And so I think thinking about, and as you rightly said, small farms are so small. So one needs to think about how do we get to farmer producer organizations being the effective channel for creating scale for small farms. And I know there's a lot of work going on farmer producer organizations, but making them effective, connecting them to markets, reducing their transactions costs in connecting into the value chain is a really important part of what needs to happen to enhance diversity. And at the same time, investing in rural market infrastructure is important. Because I think the growth, the next big growth opportunity for small farms is not from rice and wheat. The next big growth opportunity for small farms will come from higher value products. But in order to get there, you need ways in which you can create aggregation. And that's something that we've been looking at within my team also, but there's a lot of work going on in this country thinking about effective models. So out of the many things you've raised, which I agree with, I think this is one we can continue talking.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Dr. T.R. Sharma, Deputy Director General Crop Sciences. I have enjoyed your talk very much, and it has covered a lot of things when you talked about diversity in our food system. But in spite of the fact that we have tremendous diversity in our food system, still we are unable to encash on it for alleviating malnutrition. How to make it more popular in present context when fast food is really taking up in big way in our children or other population, which is now diverted towards or attracted towards fast food. Thank you very much.
It's a really big question. And it's a global phenomenon, right? Because it's as growth has happened, as urbanization has happened, access to processed food, access to fast food is a way in which people have been trying to manage time constraints, even while trying to feed their own households. And you know, in richer countries, fast foods tend to be very cheap. And so poorer populations tend to depend a lot more on fast foods. Whereas in countries like India, it's still fashionable. And so you'll find middle class populations going into for more consumption of fast foods, burgers, pizzas, etc. So I think this is where behavior change plays a big role. I think behavior change that comes through schools and colleges, but also through families themselves, talking about what's a healthy diet, what's a balanced diet, and you know, what are the consequences of large-scale consumption of processed foods and eating out behavior. This becomes a really big part of the behavior change discussion that has to take place. I can't give you a good model of how to do it because every country is struggling with this. Every country is trying to get better at managing this. And it doesn't help when you go into small rural villages and it's easier to buy soft drinks and chips than it is to get fresh food. So that's a challenge I think we all need to be grappling.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Dr. AK Singh. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You can use the mic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, sir. My name is AK Singh, and I'm working as DTG Horticulture. It was really a feast to watch your presentation, sir. So many facts which are so close to the thinking plots of India. When we talk of the access to the balanced diet, the economic as well as the physical access also is a big impediment in that. So often when we visit the farmers, those who are cultivating the horticultural crops, particularly leafy vegetables and more nourishing vegetable crops, they don't know the value of these things. Although they are selling in the market, buyers are coming there, or they themselves are going to the market, but they don't know themselves that how valuable is these vegetables are for them in terms of the balanced diet. So this remains a very big question, actually, what kind of model, as Dr. Sharma was also saying, that can be evolved or developed, and how the skill and continuity in that can raise the ability for these people to increase their buying capacity for fruits and vegetables. In case of fruits, none of the fruits in India is less than 40 rupees a kg. And a man who survives on a daily wage, I mean, more than 200 million population, on 300 rupees or 350 rupees, how they can afford if they have a family of 3 or 4 members? If husband and wife both are working, hardly 750 rupees on a daily basis, 2 kids. So the meat, poultry, or milk, even fruits and vegetables, forget the dry fruits. That is really a very big stumbling block to me, it appears, in the process of realizing a dream of a scenario devoid of malnutrition. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. So thank you, Dr. A.K. Singh, sir. Let us also take one question from a lot of vice chancellors. They are attending this meeting, sir. So one vice chancellor has raised a hand. Arpit, can you? So may I request you, sir, please put up your question.
So myself, Professor Chandrababu, Vice Chancellor, Kerala Agriculture University. At the outset, Dr. Prabhu, thank you for your lucid presentation. Not only in cereals, India has made very good strides in vegetables and horticulture crops also, and also milk and meat production. So only what I feel that how this can be distributed across to the masses, as you rightly pointed out, the cokes and other things are available even in rural markets. Why can't these vegetable fruits, they are seasonal and the shelf life is very short. And why can't we make in the supply chain, one state is producing a very, glut in the market, whereas the neighboring state, you have told regional differences in obesity and nutrition also. So when there is a large production in one part of the country, why can't it can be very rapidly transported in the cold chain systems made equitably available so that farmers can also get remunerative prices for their produces? Thank you, sir.
The two questions are very closely related, so maybe we can talk through them. So I think both of you rightly point out that there's so many levels of issues around increasing diversity in the food system. One is around interstate movement of food, interstate movement of fresh food, which still has restrictions on it. Second is investments in cold chains and value chain infrastructure, which for perishable products is still very poor, and creating incentives for farmers to be part of that value chain. So coming back to how do you reduce costs for small farmers to connect into these value chains? That's an important part. But then looking at behavior change, make how people understanding the nutrition value of different foods and understanding what it means for their health. And I think some of the work that's being done through women's self-help groups of promoting nutrition behavior change using women's self-help groups as a platform has shown some really promising results here on at least creating learnings on what's a better diet, etc. And the final point is in many rural communities, home gardens, kitchen gardens, etc. Have also been an effective tool for poor small farm households to access better diversity. So I think this is a big multidimensional issue, but it requires policy change at various levels, all the way from the central government level down to the district level. Okay. Hope that addresses some of the questions on this.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Paddy, you wanted to ask?
Let me begin with my gratitude to the ICAR that we have our Ikrisat GB chair as the speaker today, because I have been listening to this lecture series for last so many months. And today the DG ICAR, the entire group of Deputy Directors General are there. Dr. Anupam Burman, host of other Vice Chancellors are there. It gives a feeling of immense pride. And thank you to the DG and Dr. Agrawal for this particular session. My question is regarding the policy implementation, because Professor, I entirely agree to the policy framework that you give to ensure food and nutrition security. But agriculture as such is a state subject, and there are other ministries involved to bring it to the fruition and to the last mile. So I read it from your earlier book, the Food Systems Transformation for a Rising India, wherein you suggest the top level policy decisions should be left to the ministries, and the implementation at the ground level should be left to the local self governments. So I'd just like to hear these thoughts again, and maybe you could add further. Thank you.
Thank you, Arvinda. Actually, some states have done better than others, right? So if you look at a state such as Kerala, they've had much more success in creating a more diverse food system and improved access to perishable foods. And how did they do that? They basically promoted rural markets across the states. They promoted ways in which small farms can connect into the value chains, but they also promoted high value agriculture in a big way, from export oriented agriculture, both internationally, but also within the country. And that created an opportunity for small farms to connect in. So that market orientation played a big role. And in some other states, the focus, while there's acknowledgement that there's need to improve diversity, explicit policy hasn't been in place. So if you take any of the East Indian states, you don't have the cold chain infrastructure, you don't have the transport infrastructure and the communication infrastructure. Unless you put some basics in place, the private sector will not come and build that value chain. We can talk about aggregating models for small farms. That's one part of it. But unless you build that chain, aggregation models will not work. So taking that picture in view, and that has to happen from the local governments. And state governments have to play a big role in that. All the way. I mean, organizing farmer groups, etc., panchayats would play a big role in that. So it's policy change at all levels, I think, is really important.
Thank you, Professor Pingali. Yes, Dr. Mohanty, he's our Assistant Director General. So, Dr. Mohanty, can you put your question? No. Please unmute yourself and put up your question, Dr. Mohanty.
So first of all, compliments for the excellent talk. Then I would like to know how much you feel that lack of nutritional knowledge is also a big contributing factor. Like people do not really understand what is the difference between food and nutrition. We take food, but what is nutrition, balanced diet? People we say nutrition, malnutrition. We understand the undernutrition, but overnutrition, obesity is also a problem. Suppose a rural setup, people take food. They do not know the combination. People take rice and potato. Instead of rice, if they take rice plus say dry fish even, or some vegetables, it makes some balanced. So how much that contributes to this problem? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, as I said, knowledge and behavior change are a big part of the issue that needs to be addressed. Nutrition knowledge is quite weak among all populations. We're not just talking about rural populations, but even among urban populations, having clear nutrition knowledge and going beyond traditional. Traditionally we eat it this way, to saying maybe sometimes we need to change the way we consume certain foods. As you were saying, consuming rice and potatoes together doesn't make as much sense as rice with some other vegetables. So that kind of change has to happen. I think it's a long-term transition that will happen, but starting with schools can be a good place.
Yeah, Dr. A.K. Singh, Director IAR. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think the question was partly answered. That was one main question that I had, that illiteracy among literate. Forget about those who are not literate, but illiteracy among literate is the major problem in the people who have both physical as well as physical address to good nutritious diet, but because of lack of knowledge, they are also suffering from all problems. The others are suffering because they don't have access. The other point was Dr. Birthal mentioned about the states with high productivity associated with high obesity. Punjab, you mentioned. So also one region in addition to high mechanization is most agriculture in these states is dependent on the migratory labor coming from, eastern UP, from Bihar, and then hardly people, landlords working there doing any physical work. Thank you.
May I ask a question? Hello.
Dr. Gupta, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Agrawal. My compliments to Dr. Pingali for a wonderful lecture, and at the end, the policy shift which he has suggested. I have a question to Dr. Pingali. Of late, Government of India has been promoting natural farming, and natural farming does not involve any input, external input. So what is your opinion on the likely impact of this technology if it is adopted in a big way, especially among small and marginal farmers? What's going to happen? What do you think?
Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for putting me on the spot. Yeah. So the way I think about natural farming is it's an important area for India to look at and to see where are the opportunities. And some of the opportunities are going to be in perishable products like vegetables, fruit, etc. But I want to be careful to say natural farming cannot be the answer to all farming issues within the country. And to think that India will transform itself where you have how many hundreds of millions small farms, that all of India will go into natural farming is going to be a really difficult proposition. And one of the issues around natural farming is it also requires a lot of labor, and it's very labor intensive. And so you're asking farmers to really increase the labor input when the scarcest input in farming today is labor. And because of off-farm employment opportunities, etc. So the recent surveys that were done show that in an average Indian farm household, more than half the income comes from outside the farm. And that means the opportunity cost of labor is very high. So that time that they spend working outside the farm would have to be brought back into the farm to do natural farming, which means the returns to that natural farming would have to be so much higher. So which would then say you have to be focused on really high value crops and not on low value crops. So that's one issue. But I have a second issue. The second issue is it's not either or. I think you can look at ways in which you can be much more efficient and much more environmentally conservative in the way you do farming relative to what we're doing today. And that can come through more efficient use of inputs, through better technology adoption, etc. So I plead for a mix. I plead for a mix of options for a country of so many hundreds of millions of small farms. In the same way as not all of us will do things exactly the same as urban professionals. Each of us chooses to do some things differently. We should expect something similar from the farm community, where we provide great options, and then the choices would be what they would pick. Sorry for a roundabout answer to your question.
Thank you very much, sir. And thanks to all our audience for putting the questions. May I request now Dr. Mohapatra, the Secretary DARE and DG ICAR, who is chairing this session, to give the remarks, chairman's remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agarwal. Let me take this opportunity, first of all, congratulate the speaker of the day. Let us give him a very big hand. Dr. Pingali talks very smooth and very calm. And with that calm voice and with that calmness, he communicates very effectively. And that's what we have seen. Difficult topics and described in simple terms with graphs which speak for themselves, and describing very nicely how India's agriculture has moved, and starting with that the famines are the past events, and we have started forgetting famines in this country. And famines used to strike us very regularly, and we have to beg and borrow and then import, and that's what he highlighted, how rice import has declined, and after 1990s, how we are increasing export. And so also in other items, and that's a very important point which is he highlighted. And that's a lesson that technology, innovations, and other in fact interventions that this country put in place. That's what he said, that 4 I's, the incentives, the infrastructure, the institutional reforms, and so on and so forth. These have contributed very significantly to what we see. Of course, the base of that was the innovation, and without innovation, it could not have happened. Investment has happened not only in the infrastructure sector, but also in taking the innovation, developing innovation, of course, and then taking the innovation to the end users. So these are the kind of drivers of change that happened in Indian agriculture. We not only became food self-sufficient, but also we see with regard to milk, with regard to other sectors, of course, we focused on food grains, but that has happened in many sectors. But we have challenges. He has highlighted, in very clear terms. We all describe challenges, but his way of description and presentation of those challenges were very interesting. Putting the triple burden of nutrition in a perspective. We have hunger, we have hidden hunger, and we have also obesity. And these, you see in the country and across regions. Of course, he has given this aggregated picture, for whole of India, and how these challenges are there. But certainly there is a variation region-wise. And once we understand those problems region-wise, certainly we should be able to address them. Of course, challenge of climate change, land degradation, and other issues he has described. And then food, preference and the diversity, as it was described and presented by in the form of questions by the others, particularly the DDGs and all that, those who are present here, that the food availability is there, but hunger still persists. We are exporting, and we say that hungry people are still there, Even calorie hunger is still there, protein hunger is still there, and hidden hunger is still there. And and then stunting and all those challenges, particularly in children and women, the malnutrition, which is so pervasive, and across states that you see that those problems. So these are real challenges. So making nutritious food available to those who need and those who do not have adequate purchasing power is a big challenge. So all those were highlighted by Professor Pingali. And finally, giving the solutions, how one can actually, deliver on the targets. Many important points he has talked about, while presenting his lecture, and also while responding to the queries and questions of those who are attending. Multi-sectoral approach is certainly required, and nutri-education is so important, which came out while discussion. Whether it is uneducated poor in the rural setting, or the educated reach in the urban setting, and everywhere the education literacy is so important. And in fact, while we are asking questions, we also remember that we all have a responsibility. And how do we really spread this literacy all through? And we have to bell the cat, actually. Who will do it? And it's a big responsibility for us. And Prabhu Pingali Sahab did not mention that what ICAR should be doing, but actually it's explicit that ICAR has also a role to play. And how do we do? And growing high value commodities despite the fragmented land holding, and aggregation happening, but aggregation to take off in the form of value chains for rural infrastructure to be there in place. And these are very, very important points. And obviously, central regulations and schemes alone would not really be sufficient. The local governments and their participation and their role would be very, very crucial in contributing to that. And very important points which he highlighted, that in this revolution that we talk about, the demand side and supply side, he talked about the farmer producer organization as a solution to the small fragmented land holdings. But how effectively these FPOs would work and how successful they would be, so that would determine the supply side issues, particularly in the context of small marginal land holdings as we go along. And precision and smart farming, which he highlighted, I think that's another important point. And bringing much needed precision there would enhance efficiency, would also add to the farmer's income, add to the quality of the produce. And many important points here highlighted. I would not like to really go into those details, but these are the issues. I think strengthening rural markets should be very, very important. That's the reason why the concept of e-market has come. But success of it depends on many factors. Somewhere it is successful, somewhere it has its own problem, but then more and more markets are getting linked through each system. And as we expand this, certainly there would be more benefits accruing to regions which were neglected. He talked about Eastern region, he mentioned about it, that there are issues and concerns still persisting there. So we all know this, but then how do we really address them? So it's not easy. So bringing, equity and of course, in the context of attitude change and so many things he has talked about. So I'll not go into those details. So it's a feast, really, Dr. Prabhu Pingali Saab, and we all thoroughly enjoyed. And there would be, there are messages for us to take home. And when we prepare this document on 75 lecture series, so we would be at least 4 or 5 action points for us to work on, to implement and develop a further detailed, implementation plan. So you'll be actually doing that. And I'm sure if there is any, further guidance required, Dr. Agrawal would be, discussing with you and getting your viewpoints. And in fact, that's what I have said, that every lecture should have at least 5, recommendations, which we would be further deliberating for the purpose of implementation. And anywhere we need further inputs and guidance, we would certainly get back to you. And that is very, very important. So as we are discussing that the 75 lecture series must not end after 75th one. And we must continue because they are all learning experiences. So much of richness is there in each one of those lectures. The other day, Mr. Atul Jain presented about the local food system and linking that with the life cycle and how in traditional Indian system, the food is linked to a particular stage of development. And how that particular development stage needs are adequately addressed through different kinds of food items which are traditionally thought about. There must have been some research, some observations, keen observations on that. So very interesting. That was, collected from various regions of the country and presented very nicely and putting some graphics there and very interesting ones. So likewise, so I think, these series of lectures, those who are attending, certainly they would realize, and otherwise these lectures are there. Anybody wishes to hear, listen to any one of these lectures can really, take advantage of and learn, even if someone has missed. So today it was a very fortunate day for us that Professor Prabhu Pingali, having a vast experience in international organizations, working in various organizations, mention was made about a few of those, and then, his own in-depth, knowledge as a teacher at Cornell. He continues teaching. I mean, that's what was very, very evident. Very smoothly, explaining the difficult aspects of the complex aspects of food systems in India. And it's not just production, and he went to various other things, the supply and then market and many other things. So basically comprehensively covering the food system in India. So thank you very much, Professor Pingali, for agreeing to our request and coming over to this place and physically being here with us to deliver the lecture. So we thoroughly enjoyed. So profuse thanks to you, and hopefully we would continue interacting to learn more and getting more critical inputs. So about issues, some of those issues that you just described. Profuse thanks to Dr. Agrawal for continuing this agenda, and despite all odds, it's not easy that every week you have a lecture and then you have to arrange and then successfully get it done. So thank you very much. So thanks to all of you, all colleagues who have joined here physically, and all those who have joined virtually. Many seniors were here, Professor Burma here, who has joined physically. And thank you, Professor Burma, for being here from my side. And also Professor R.B. Singh, I didn't see him today, but he used to be there. Professor Gupta and many other vice chancellors. Thanks to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for nicely summarizing. So first of all, I am thankful to Professor Pingali for having agreed to deliver this important talk on a very important topic, and that what we have achieved from this green revolution and what could not work and what are the policies. And the lot of questions we got from this house and from those colleagues who were who joined through this virtual mode. And still, after we took the last question, there are three, four more questions, and people are just complimenting you. So we'll just pass on those questions to you, friends. It's a very important series, as I told you, and widely attended by the persons. The next lecture is on 11th by the Secretary DBT. So please be ready for that. And this is a first lecture, as I told you, in the hybrid mode. But I think there was no problem in the voice or in seeing anybody here. So we can continue this hybrid mode whenever required, whenever possible, in arrangement with the speaker. So thank you all the esteemed colleagues. Our all Deputy Director Generals are here. Especially I am thankful to Dr. Padi, who could make it to bring Professor Pingali, and then Professor Anupam Verma. I think it's a surprise for us that you could make it, and all our director colleagues, senior colleagues from ICAR headquarters who have physically joined, and all those who have virtually joined. So thank you once again, and we wish to see you in the next lecture. Thank you. Namaskar.